Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Sheila Brown, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs. It's my pleasure, on behalf of our Board of Directors, to welcome you all here this evening to the fourth and last in our Trust in Education series. For those of you who are not aware, the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs was established by two institutions, the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University, in whose premises we're pleased to host these events. Both institutions continue to support us, and we're also supported by individual foundation and corporate donors. And we could not function as a centre without the support of many, many individuals, and it's always nice to take the opportunity to acknowledge them. Our mission at CCEPA is to provide an arena for critical thinking, discussion and research into current ethical challenges in society. And we do that by sponsoring public presentations such as this evening, supporting research. We've just sent out a call for proposals for 2 research fellowships at CCEPA. And we also assist organizations to integrate values into their operations. We're particularly anxious to reach out to diverse audiences, very much like to engage as many people as we can in our work. We're delighted this evening to welcome Dr. Bernard Shapiro as our keynote speaker, and he will be introduced more formally in a few moments. I want to acknowledge just a few people in the room. The work that went into the development of this Trust in Education series was led in large part by my predecessor, Frank Schwartz, who is at the back of the room, working with our general manager, Chris Stover, who's at the front of the room, and our program committee, and a number of our board members, including Alan Shaw, who serves on our board. And of course, once you serve on a board like this and you're actively engaged in planning a program, well, guess what? You get to participate in it. So Alan has kindly agreed to moderate this evening's session, and Alan is going to give you an overview of how the evening will work, where we've come to this point, and then introduce our keynote speaker and our discussants. I encourage you, before you leave this evening, to complete the evaluation form on the desks around the room, and to help yourself to any of the materials at the back of the room, literature that we have, or to put your name on our mailing list, or to order DVDs. So will you please join me in welcoming Mr. Alan Shaw to the podium.
Well, thank you, Sheila. Good evening, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Alan Shaw, CCEPA board member and your moderator for this evening's discussion. And I'd like to welcome you all here this evening and thank you for taking the time to engage in our conversation on what we think is a very important topic. In developing this series, Trust in Education, we wanted to get at what works and what doesn't work in our education system, in an effort to get a clearer picture of where we need to go as we work toward providing our youth with the skills they need to go to work, to function in society, and to be critical thinkers. We've danced around these questions a bit, but skillfully, I hope. First, hearing some hard data from Dr. Paul Capin of the Canadian Council on Learning, which measures and monitors learning in this country. It was Paul Capin who said that when you increase public reporting on the strengths and weaknesses of education, you increase public trust. Let's not miss the value in that statement. The global perspective came next from Sir John Daniel of the Commonwealth of Learning. Sir John talked about freedom as the measure of development and free people being the drivers of development, and how important education is for fostering freedom in developing countries. Sir John also revealed shocking statistics on present trends. that worldwide there will still be some 29 million, I repeat, 29 million children not in school by 2015, a number almost equivalent to the entire population of Canada. The perspective in this presentation is not to be overlooked either. From there, we took our discussion to the Nova Scotia high schools and asked a handful of student debaters about the quality of education. They defined that question by arguing for and against merit pay for teachers as a way to improve the quality of education students receive. And while this debate did not specifically target whether students are being prepared to go to work, function in society, and be critical thinkers, it was a valuable exercise in ascertaining if such a measure as merit pay could advance the quality of education. You have heard now what our concept of this series was, where we have traveled with it, and tonight we are here in conclusion. This is our opportunity to achieve our objective. To help us to that, we bring to you one of Canada's foremost educators, Dr. Bernard J. Shapiro, Canada's first federal ethics commissioner and former principal and vice chancellor of McGill University. Dr. Shapiro will talk to us for the better part of an hour before we move to our capstone panel, made up of Veronica Lacey, President and CEO of the Learning Partnership, whom we have collaborated with for this Trust in Education series, and Ray Ivany, the newly appointed President of Acadia University. Following Dr. Shapiro's address, we'll hear reflective and additive thoughts from our panelists for roughly another 30 minutes. It's my role as moderator to not only direct thoughts from the keynote address to panelists, but to interject to ensure we achieve our objective for the evening of examining the quality of education and whether we do, can, or should trust our current system of education to produce students who can go to work, function in society, and be critical thinkers. Once we've all heard from the panel, we'll move to you, our audience, and open the floor to your questions, which you are free to pose to each and any of us here. But before we get to that, a little about the illustrious life of Dr. Bernard Shapiro. Born and raised in Montreal, he earned his undergraduate degree at McGill University. After graduation, he and his brother took over and managed the family restaurant business for several years. Dr. Shapiro received his doctorate in education from Harvard University, and he later joined the faculty of Boston University, where he became Associate Dean of the university's School of Education. Returning to Canada in the 70s, he became Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Western Ontario in London, and was later appointed Vice President Academic and Provost. Dr. Shapiro has also held the position of Director of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. He was appointed Deputy Minister of Education for the province of Ontario and also served as Deputy Minister of Skills Development, Deputy Secretary of Cabinet, and several other Deputy Minister roles. Following his retirement from the Ontario Public Service, Dr. Shapiro joined the University of Toronto as a professor of education and public policy. In 1999, he was appointed Officer of the Order of Canada. In 2002, was appointed as Grand Officer de l'Ordre National de Québec. That probably means I won't get that offer, having made that pronunciation. He is also chair of national and international education groups, too numerous to mention. Dr. Shapiro is the author of many articles on curriculum, public policy and education, the development of logical thinking in young people, and educational research and methodology. He is the author of the Shapiro Report, released in the mid-90s, which recommended consolidation of teacher education programs in Nova Scotia and the expansion of the Bachelor of Education degree program to 2 years in length. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Dr. Bernard Shapiro.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm very glad to be here this evening. I was going to begin by some thank yous, but I think perhaps at first I do not intend to speak for the better part of an hour. I do intend to speak probably for half an hour or 40 minutes. I think that's as long as I have anything interesting to say. But I do want to thank the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs simply for asking me to be a part of this evening's conversation or discussion. When I first was contacted by them, I assumed that what they were going to want me to talk about was, let's say, my up and down, a rather rocky career as Canada's first ethics commissioner. But they thankfully didn't do that, so it saved me from having to reflect on that more often than I would like to. And then I thought, well, I don't know if that's better or worse than asking me to talk about something that relates to trust in education. I mean, trust is a very rare commodity these days. Almost every day in the daily newspaper, you see some example of some institution or representative of some institution who you are supposed to be trusting, only to find out that that trust is in fact ill-placed. I don't know whether it has to do with the cult of celebrity or something else. I'm not quite sure why that is, or perhaps I'm just more sensitive to it than I used to be. I'm not sure. But it is asking a lot these days to ask people to trust almost anything, because we tend to be a kind of scandal-focused society rather than an achievement-focused society, at least in the public media. Nevertheless, that doesn't make the topic less important. It just makes it somewhat more difficult. The previous three speakers in this four-part series focused on trust in education, have at least in the summaries of their presentations, which have been made available to me, raised informative and provocative questions, and I hope I'll be able to live up to that standard this evening. Paul Capon, President and CEO of the Canadian Council on Learning, was the first speaker in this series. He asked, referring to the 4 pillars of education outlined in Jacques Delors' report for UNESCO, is our education system doing what it is supposed to do? And does it educate students to do, to be, and to know? I have been asked to focus on the quality of education in terms, perhaps, of what contributes to quality. How do we measure quality? How do we ensure quality in our public schools? And as those of you who may have seen the little circular for this presentation, the topic of my presentation is best encapsulated, I think, in 3 questions, and I'll answer them seriatim. What do we want? How can we get it? And when will we know? What do we want? We cannot, of course, even begin to answer the question of actual quality without coming to grips with the question of what are our shared objectives for public education at whatever level. That is, without answering the question, what do we want? In a society as increasingly heterogeneous as our own, it could in fact be the case that we have no shared objectives for education. And even more alarmingly, that there is no shared concept of Canadian citizenship in the first place. However, I choose to believe, whether I'm correct or not, or whether you agree with me or not, I choose to believe, and I operate on the assumption on a day-to-day basis, that however inchoate and incoherent our objectives for education are, they are nevertheless actually present, not only in our minds, but I would say in our souls. Further, I assume that these objectives are and must be consistent with the many challenges of living in a small L liberal democracy. Alan mentioned just a few moments ago that Sir John Daniels was talking about the question of freedom and the importance of education for free societies. Well, we live certainly in a relatively free society. People disagree on how free it is and how appropriate. That's another matter altogether. But I would say, if I had to define a liberal democracy in just a few words, I would say that it's a form of living together that's based on 3 important things. and I'm oversimplifying, I know, but nevertheless I've tried to focus on what I consider the most important. One is the rule of law. A second is a belief in a set of natural and individual human rights that are prior to and superordinate to the rule of the majority. And third is, of course, the free exercise by each adult citizen of the electoral franchise. In such a context, it seems to me that the objective of education, that is, what it is we want as an outcome, is the intellectual and moral autonomy of each individual. The intellectual and the moral autonomy of each individual. I do not, of course, deny the importance of group affiliations, whether, for example, occupational groups, religious groups, ethnic groups, cultural, racial, or tribal groups. I don't want to deny the importance of those kinds of groupings to the ongoing meaning of life for any particular individual, or in fact any set of individuals. I insist, however, that in a liberal democracy, the individual citizen is primary and the basic unit, and therefore it is a development of the individual that should be the focus of the educational enterprise. This is why, in my conception of the aim of education, I focus on the autonomy of the individual. When the individual citizen enters a ballot box, it is her or his individual choice upon which we all depend. It is not indeed stretching it too far to say that the aim of education is to enable that citizen to make a choice that is not only her or his own, but to make a choice that is well-informed and heartfelt. And I think those two adjectives are, one is as important as the other. One needs to make well-informed choices, and one needs to make committed choices, that is, heartfelt choices. And that in fact then deals with both the intellectual and moral challenges of being a Canadian in the 21st century. I recognize, of course, that adult citizens need to deal with many challenges other than those of electoral campaigns. Among the most obvious of these are the challenges of knowledge society and, consequently, the quickly changing and ever more complex workplace, the challenges of relating effectively to fellow citizens with histories and values vastly different than our own, and the challenges of growing up when change is so rapid that the accumulated wisdom of parents may not be as reliable a guide as it once was. As Groucho Marx is reported to have put it, the future is simply not what it used to be. In responding to these and other challenges, it will be necessary to focus on knowledge or intellectual outcomes. Indeed, individuals need to have more knowledge and be more knowledgeable than ever before. And they need to continuously develop that knowledge over an entire lifetime, both inside and outside schools, both inside and outside the workplace. Knowledge alone, however, will never be sufficient. If the choices made in the ballot box or in any other context in which a citizen acts are to be, as I put it before, both well-informed and heartfelt, these choices are to be characterized not only by knowledge, but also commitment. Schools and educators must deal not only with the intellectual, but also the moral development of students at whatever age. Otherwise, how can we explain the age-old struggle of so many, albeit not all, but of so many people, toward goodness, not as a means, but as an end in itself? Well, it's one thing to have some notion of what it is we want. The trick, I suppose, is how can we get it? How can we achieve the desired outcome of the intellectual and moral autonomy of our students? I need first to admit that as far as I know, there is no magic bullet or magic algorithm which, if we only apply, will generate the outcomes that we seek. If there were, of course, we wouldn't need conferences of this sort. We wouldn't need to make speeches at each other and they've been going on endlessly for goodness knows how long. We would just go out and do it. But there is no magic bullet. And people that are seeking it are, I guess, inserting its kind of wish fulfillment as opposed to dealing with the realities that they face on a day-to-day basis. So that although there is no magic bullet, I would want to say that we are not without guidelines and without insights that can assist us. And I would like to take a few minutes this evening to share what I believe are a few of the most important of these insights, things that we have learned from both ongoing experience in the classroom, in the workplace, wherever, and generations of research work in both education and in schooling. And it's important, of course, to always keep reminding ourselves that education and schooling are not the same thing. Schools are intended to achieve certain kinds of objectives. Education objectives are much broader and are the shared responsibility of many, many more actors, participants from the community. So let me try and list. I've chosen 6 of these. There's nothing magic about the number 6. The 6 that happened to appeal to me to be important when I wrote the paper, and I'm going to share them with you tonight. You'll think of your own, I'm sure, that will be equally interesting. First, we must be reasonable in terms of the degree to which it is possible for schools, not education as a whole, but for schools, to achieve the desired outcome. The day is long since past when one could imagine the school as a cathedral of the 21st century, that is, the institution or set of institutions through which one can transcend all the difficulties of modern life. This is simply not the case. Schools can and have achieved much. There is nothing to apologize for as far as I'm concerned. They can and probably will achieve more. But they cannot do this simply by pulling themselves up from within as a kind of bootstrapped operation. As the French would say, trop c'est trop. Enough is enough. It has become all too easy to think we can resolve our problems in education, more generally speaking, by announcing that the schools will do it. I'm reminded of an anecdote that occurred to me as a grandparent. I, at the time, was visiting 2 of my grandchildren, young girls, who were at the time, I think, about 3 and 5. Anyway, we arrived, we came by a plane to the city in which they lived, and we arrived, and my son and daughter-in-law were there, and these 2 little girls were there. Anyway, we said hello, and my daughter-in-law said to the youngest girl, the 3 or 4-year-old, said, "Why don't you give Grandpa a kiss?" And she said, "Let Molly do it." And I think it's important to keep that in mind. I mean, that's a silly little example, I know. But it's important to keep in mind that we tend to imagine or not imagine real difficulties. Assume we have an institution. They're called schools. They're educators, aren't they? Why don't they resolve this problem? And of course, that's just pretending. Instead of thinking, it's pretending, because the responsibilities for education are much, much broader. And one of the real challenges facing us, if we want to be able to trust, is not only to trust them, the educators, but to trust ourselves, that we can take up our responsibility, depending on where we are in the community, to deal with the education not only of our own children, parents, of course, are the first educators, but also with everybody else's children and adults. We keep talking about lifelong learning. It's kind of a cliche. You hesitate to mention it practically. I've tried to use a slightly different word. It's even less helpful, I think. But I just call it life-wide learning. Not because it's not true that one has to keep learning, but we have to expand what we call learning and the arrangements we make for learning. We have to expand the number of people that are involved in it in one way or another, not simply as learners, but also as teachers, far beyond the group of people we currently refer to as teachers, whether at the elementary, secondary, or post-secondary level. Second, because we have learned that our objectives cannot be achieved by schools, however sophisticated and however well-funded, acting entirely alone, other actors, as I've just said, most particularly families, and I think most particularly employers, with respect to their own employees and the wider community, must come to play a much larger part than they are at the present time. Indeed, the learning partnership, Veronica's here, is actually an interesting step in that direction. It's not as wide as anyone would like it to be, but it is at least a step to say to other people in the community out there, you cannot just tell us what to do. You've got to be a part of the solution of doing it. Third, in the knowledge-drenched society in which we must all now find our way, we must learn not only how to more imaginatively harness communications technologies, but also how to use these technologies to emphasize the responsibility of the individual for his or her own learning. I was talking to Veronica earlier this afternoon about a particular example that I picked up from the New York Times about a week ago, in which they were featuring some schools in New York State who were trying to deal with the bullying problem by having large-scale units focused on empathy. How is it one can learn to empathize what it's like to be the other? I don't know, I'm reminded actually of a quite well-known Israeli novelist, Amos Oz, who says he spends his entire life thinking about what is it like to be X or Y or Z, and tries to inform his own novelistic imagination by that. Well, if there's going to be time for that, if that's good, let's presume it's good. If it's not, we can think of some better idea. But let's assume it's good. Where is the time coming from? If the school is going to be doing that, and it's hard to imagine that that's not a serious problem for the school to deal with, then we must try to imagine individual students using the communication technologies to take much more responsibility for things that we otherwise would be teaching them. It's not easy to quite imagine that, and depending on the context in which you're working. In some communities it would be easy, in others hard, but it's going to be necessary. If people cannot learn to take the responsibility for their own learning to a greater extent than they have in the past, then we're not going to achieve the kinds of objectives we're talking about. In a society which is not only knowledge-drenched, but is one in which new knowledge is constantly being developed, particular content, in fact, can no longer be the central focus of the curriculum. It is not, of course, that content is unimportant. Rather, I would say it is sometimes, let's not overdo this, it is sometimes less important than two other factors. These are, first, the ability of the individual to use all of the available technologies to learn independently, continuously and afresh, and second, the desire and motivation of that individual to do so. After all, what a school, what an educator owes every student is a program that will develop that student to as close to his potential or her potential as possible. However, what each student owes the rest of us is to never, over a whole lifetime, never do less than the best of what he or she is capable of doing. And if that can't work on both sides, it won't work at all. There's simply too much out there. The needs of the society are too great and too interesting, too complex, etc. Fourth, in dealing with the essentials of content, we need to broaden our scope. For the key skills of the future will not be limited to basic literacy and numeracy. It will include them, of course, but will include the broader conceptual vocabulary that deals with such matters as critical thinking, which Alan referred to before, anticipation of consequences, effective participation in group action, conflict mediation, to say nothing about tolerance for ambiguity. There is not always, after all, a right answer. Appreciation of diversity, responsibility, pride in the quality of one's work, and compassion. That's a long list. But it is part of what's needed in the education in the years ahead. Again, to imagine that these outcomes can be the sole responsibility of a school or any institution is to live in a fantasy world. If a society does not fully engage or indeed exhibit these outcomes, there will be no use in imagining that schools will be able to do so. Today's young people are wise in the ways of the world to an extent never possible at an earlier time. They know about our cult of celebrity. They know, from whatever the political or business scandal of the day, when we educators are saying one thing about the world, while our students stand often silent, not always silent, but often silent witnesses to something else entirely. Fifth, we can take heart in wonderful new developments in neuroscience and genetics in terms of support for the intellectual/moral agenda. On the neuroscience side, the work of Michael Gazzaniga, and if any of you haven't read The Ethical Brain, which is his, I think, most recent book, I may not be right about that, but I think it is, I advise you it's a very slim little volume, and it's very good. But anyway, his work, and the work of others, of course, has shown, at least to my satisfaction, not only that moral reasoning is good for survival, which is something that's been claimed for a long time, but also that human beings are hardwired in some sense to believe and have an innate moral sense. That is, a basic human capacity to make judgments about right or wrong. Not a basic human capacity to know what is right or wrong. That's a different question altogether. But a basic human capacity to at least make those kinds of evaluative judgments. It appears, moreover, that when someone is willing to act on a moral belief, it is because the emotional part of her or his brain has become active when considering the moral question at hand. It is also clear from the same body of work, a number of different researchers, of course, that one does not go from the intellectual to the moral sphere just through reasoning. It is not enough to teach people how to reason about moral questions. These dimensions are, in fact, much more interactive than we previously understood, so that moral emotions can and do direct intellectual thinking and behavior, as well as the other way around. This is work that arose from the observation that everybody makes, that people often announce what their beliefs are without acting on them in practice. And so people began to wonder, why would this be the case? And at least this is one possible understanding of how that would be the case. One no longer has to choose, in that context, between what you might call the classical tradition and the romantic tradition. You can have both because they interact with each other. There is, that is to say, no warrant for faith in pure reason or the purity of our own reasoning. Nevertheless, what a wonderful set of natural platforms we now have, platforms of new knowledge on which to work toward moral autonomy, albeit with the understanding that the lessons of modern knowledge about the nature of the world may produce conflicts with personal spiritual belief systems of one kind or another that are held by billions of people. It's no use pretending this knowledge is value-free. It is not. And learning how to cope with that, both as educators and as learners, is something that we face for the future. On the genetics side, I have become convinced, and here the recent work of Richard Nisbett is central to my own thought, and his most recent book, for those of you that are interested in that kind of thing, is called Intelligence and How to Get It. It's very, very interesting and good reading, and it's meant for a lay audience. You don't have to be a researcher in this area to get a lot out of it. But anyway, I've become convinced, in looking at this body of work, both from Richard Nisbett and other people, of course, that IQ tests measure something real and important, and that differences in IQ within groups are at least partly genetic in composition. People argue about how much. This implies, however, I believe, nothing about the average differences between groups. And that's an important matter for Canadians. As we develop more and more subgroups within our societies, we deal with racial differences, with ethnic differences, with linguistic differences, all kinds of differences about communities in which people grow up. It's crucially important to understand that this genetic component of IQ is very convincing when you're talking about differences within groups. It has very little value when you talk about differences between groups. Therefore, it should be possible for schooling to move forward on the tentative assumption that the IQ differences between groups that differ in linguistic, ethnic, or racial grounds are primarily environmental. That is subject to change. In any case, since IQ scores have been rising at about the rate of 3 points a decade, and since beyond a certain level, about 115 or 118, something like that, there is no correlation between IQ and creativity or genius, the role of intelligence in determining success may come to be small, if we don't look too far into the future, by comparison with such moral traits, for example, as conscientiousness and perseverance. 6, I am coming to the end of the list finally. We have become more conscious and more adept at dealing with what for many years was a very uncomfortable difference between the public and the professional educators as to what really works in the classroom. Dramatically oversimplifying, teaching practices used in the public schools have fallen into one of two categories, and I know I'm oversimplifying. One would be the kind of traditional teacher-centered approach on the one hand, and the other would be the progressive student approach on the other. Parents and the public have generally preferred the former, that is, a traditional teacher-centered approach, and is very convincingly summarized by the late Jean Shaw in her book, The Academic Achievement Challenge. The research often focuses on academic achievement, and therefore limited, but virtually never, for example, on moral development, has clearly indicated that it is in fact, that is, the latter, the traditional teacher-centered approach, is simply more effective when we're dealing with academic achievement. Professional educators, however, have often insisted and acted upon the belief that the progressive student-centered approach is to be preferred. Admittedly, professional educators have a much more expansive view of the mission of the schools, and that is both a good thing, because I think they were more thoughtful about it than the general public was. Nevertheless, it can lead you as an educator, they could lead me as an educator, to really imagine the schools as the cathedral of the 21st century, something I think is not helpful as we move forward. Nevertheless, little was guaranteed to more undermine the public's trust in education and this persisting difference between the profession and the public, which in varying degrees supported it, and whom in any case the profession was intended to serve. In any case, my own observation is that this difference has narrowed in recent years, narrowed on both sides. Teachers clearly recognize the importance of delivering the basic skills so close to the public's heart, and the public is, I believe, gradually coming to understand the wider educational mission, not only of the schools, but also of many other social partners. If the schools and the wider educational community can continue step by step, Rome wasn't built in a day, so to speak, to imagine ways in which these 6 insights, or others that other people can bring forward, ways in which those can be dealt with, great progress can be imagined in achieving the appropriate outcomes of the educational and schooling enterprise. Finally, when will we know? However it is that the educational and schooling enterprise does in fact move forward, what is crystal clear to all of the participants in the enterprise is that accountability will be required. That is, school people and other educators will have to find ways to assess the quality of the outcomes that the enterprise produces. Accountability is, of course, so politically correct at the present time that it's almost a cliche. I believe, however, that even if this is the case, we will never be able to trust this or any other social enterprise, including medicine and law, for example, if that enterprise cannot demonstrate the level of its accomplishment. I believe the Canadian schools have accomplished a great deal in very difficult and challenging circumstances, accomplishing a great deal more in fact than the society which supports them has any right to expect. We as educators, whether in the elementary schools, the high schools, the preschools, the universities, have not, however, risen adequately to the challenge of illustrating the outcomes of our work. And this is more problematic in the post-secondary era than in the others, but it's problematic in all cases. It is almost as if participation, which in many areas is compulsory in any case, or graduation, which is not, was all that there was to say about the quality of the work that we do. This has led, as might have been expected in a troubled time, to the spread of high stakes for both teachers and students, high stakes testing, at least at the elementary and secondary school levels. This has produced, in my view, some real value added for the public and for the students. It has also led, of course, to the inevitable corruption of cheating by administrators, teachers, and students, and narrowing of the curriculum and declining teacher morale. The whole enterprise seems, in fact, to be a good proof of a principle of social science, which I had never heard of before until I was preparing this paper, actually, referred to as Campbell's Law. You may all have heard of it, I don't know, but anyway, I'll quote it for you. The more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. The solution is, of course, not to abandon high-stakes testing, but to widen the number and the kind of indicators that are used to report on the ongoing outcomes of schooling and the educational enterprise. If we can, in fact, agree that the objectives of education deal both with the intellectual and the moral development of human beings at whatever age, then we must respond to the challenge of developing indicators, some quantitative, others qualitative, some objective, others subjective, some reliable, others more contingent, some formative, others summative, and indicators that can more adequately reflect the range of our hopes and the range of our responsibilities. These indicators, at some future time, must at least try to deal not only with academic achievement and moral development, as if that weren't enough, but I tried to look at a list of other things that other people thought were important. And they added things like clientele satisfaction, reaction of students, parents, and employers, coherence and suitability of structures, effectiveness, articulation among levels, fairness, resource efficiency, value for money, social and political and economic context. The list goes on forever. And in a way, those lists can defeat you if you believe you, in fact, are going to do them all. But if you don't believe that, if you believe you can do some of them, 1 or 2 or 3, whatever the number is, then we'll have advanced the enterprise more than we otherwise would have. Equally important, we must use available and or new indicators in a less defensive way. If public or, in fact, private education is to make any of the real advances that both need, both must learn the value of public and interesting mistake-making. I, in fact, believe that public and interesting mistake-making is what makes for successful enterprises in every area, whether we're talking about education or business or medicine. We certainly are all busy making mistakes. They're not all interesting ones. Some of them are just silly. But there are interesting ones, and we need to be able to express the value of that publicly so that we can learn from the mistakes that we make. It's important to flaunt interesting failures as well as to celebrate interesting success. When Carol Olson and I were both in Ontario, I was a deputy minister for a while, and I used to spend 1 day a month at a school board meeting in the evening, a different school board each time. And so over the period of time, I was deputy minister for quite a long time, it was 6 or 7 years, so I was at a lot of school boards. I never saw one director of education flaunt an interesting failure. They're not stupid people. They know the political price of that is too high, and so they don't play the game. My claim is that we have to find a way of making that not the case. It's a daunting challenge, but one which we must nevertheless attempt to approximate, at least to the best of our abilities. As my colleague at McGill, Norman Henchy, long ago pointed out, when the social rhythm follows an easy and measured flow from past to present to future, an education system has a relatively clear mandate, and at least relatively speaking, its quality is easily judged and trust is more easily generated. When, however, as is currently the case, there is turbulence and discontinuity, we must recognize that the past may be an unreliable and even dangerous guide, and the present may be unstable and difficult to read. At such a time, the perspective of our future, which we've all got to keep in mind, is at once blurred and yet crucial as an approach to the quality of education. The fact that it's blurred doesn't mean we don't have to keep looking. It means it's a kind of existential problem. It never goes away. But each time you approach it, you hope to have a somewhat clearer vision than you had before. Nothing, of course, ensures success. We cannot ensure the quality of social enterprises like education, and there's no use pretending we can. Assessing the quality of education, as is the case for almost all major social undertakings, will always be what I've referred to as an existential problem, one constantly approached but never fully resolved. Life in the 21st century does not come with guarantees. Nothing, however, so guarantees failure as an unwavering commitment to the status quo. If, however, our vision becomes broad enough, if participation includes families, employers, and other social agencies and groups, if we can attract at least our share of the best and brightest to the profession, and if we can exhibit and learn from our mistakes, then we can actually at least begin to know and know better. Then and only then will there be a much better than even chance that we can be and be seen to be not only a learning society, but a wise and trusting one as well. Thank you.
Bernard, thank you. Thank you very much. Now, I am going to call on our two panelists, ask them each to make a number of remarks, and then after that, I am going to start directing questions back and forth to try to make sure we've covered things, and then we'll open it up. So, Carol, you're next up.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan, and thank you to CCEPA. Delighted to be here this evening. Let me start, first of all, by introducing one of my bosses, Doug Hall. He is a member of the board, the National Board of the Learning Partnership, and also our chief in Nova Scotia. And I just want you to know that talk about loyalty and dedication. Doug gave up his tickets free to the K.D. Lang concert to be here this evening. I I can't imagine. He deserves a round of applause. I'm sure that you will agree that there's no less favored role than to follow Bernard Shapiro in an address anywhere at any time. And many of you who, like I, have known Bernard for many years, after he finishes speaking, we want to reflect for 2 hours, lest we say something foolish and innocuous, and then ask some pertinent questions. So this is quite a challenge, Alan. Thank you for that. I'm going to, rather than respond specifically to Bernard's presentation, I'm just going to lift some threads and then hand it over to my friend and colleague Ray Ivany. And hopefully some of the exploration of what all of this means comes from the engagement of all of you in an important conversation. So I'm going to go back, first of all, to the, I guess, tenets of education, which is learning to do, to be, to know, and to live together. And let me say that having spent really a professional lifetime in education, I think that our publicly funded educational system, and I should be clear about that, does quite a good job in some areas, needs to do a much better job in other areas. So let me start with where I believe public education does an excellent job, and that is learning to live together. If you think about Canada as a country of immigrants, if you look at the whole spectrum or the paysage of Canada in terms of languages and colors and origins, if you look particularly where most young people go to school, which is in urban centers, and the diversity of our population, which so far exceeds any other urban environments in the world, it is remarkable that the young people who are graduating from our schools are graduating with such respect and acceptance of others, such a desire to live together in peace and harmony, and such compassion, not only for others in society, but for others in the world. I have the huge luxury of being able to travel across the country. And 2 years ago, we did a major study on the demographics of the student population in Canada. There are two very, very important issues that are so important for us as Canadians and so difficult for us in the educational system to actually embrace. And that is this: there are only two sources of growth in the population, in student population in Canada. One is immigrant and refugee, and one is Aboriginal. It's easier to accept and understand that if you live in Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, Edmonton. But I'm talking about the whole of Canada. So in terms of, if you think about the educational system and the way that it has changed over the last 50 years, and the young people who attend our schools, what we know today is that the young people who are going to be coming through the doors of our schools are going to be essentially different than the young people that I taught when I was in the classroom. And although I can say that we have been incredibly successful in terms of accommodating those differences, I don't know that I can say the same in the next 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25 years. Why? Because we have not done a very good job of educating our Aboriginal kids. In fact, it's an inverse ratio of success. If we say that 75% of young Canadians graduate from secondary school, and 25% do not graduate. In general terms, and I don't want to argue about is it 28 or 27, 25%, 28% of Aboriginal kids graduate from secondary school. 75% don't. And most of those young people fail in grade 8. Huge, huge meaning for all of us. In terms of our immigrant and refugee young people, the tide is turning. It used to be that first generation Canadians did better economically and in educational terms than Canadian-born children. All of that is changing. So although we have done an extremely good job in terms of living together, the future predicts a different kind of challenge and environment. Secondly, learning to be. Last January, I was in Germany, and I was giving an address to the Bertelsmann Foundation. The major issue in Germany is how to deal with immigrants. And why would they care? Because there aren't enough German little children being born. And so their society, their economy, their future is dependent on immigrants. So when we look at Canada, people want to come here. Not only that, immigrants who come to Canada are called not visitors, not guests, but new Canadians. So we are in an intense competition with the rest of the world for immigrants. We need immigrants. We need them for our own future. The education system has done a good job of integrating and fulfilling the promise that we made to immigrant parents who essentially come to our country because they want a better future for their children, not for themselves. Learning to do and learning to know. Learning to know. Did you know that Canadian youngsters, 13 to 16-year-olds, are only second best to Finland in reading and writing? This is in the OECD testing. This is not Ontario testing. It's not Saskatchewan testing. Second in the world. And we're third to Korea and Japan in math and science. And yet when I say that, people say, "Are you sure? Surely our kids are not doing that well." They are. By international standards, our youngsters are doing extremely well. The problem is that when Paul Capone says that you need the data and that will convince people, it doesn't. Because we have a framework of how young people actually perform that is based on a reality different than the reality that is presented by data. If we believed in educational data, we would never retain students who fail a grade. Why? Because it doesn't work. How many of you play golf? Some of you play golf. Some of you play tennis. You know that by doing the same thing over and over and over again, all you're doing is perfecting the same problem. Repeating the grade time and time again doesn't change anything. Well, it does actually. You do worse the second time. Falsehood. Class size makes all the difference in the world. The Liberal government in Ontario ran on this platform. We will spend billions of dollars in decreasing class size. It sounds good. There's no evidence that demonstrates that having 27 children in a grade 3 rather than 23 children in grade 3 makes a difference in academic achievement. Who believes that? Teachers, maybe, but society doesn't. And so I would say that data doesn't have any innate truth. Our perception is as powerful as the data that we have. So, we're doing well in math and science, and reading and writing. Is that good enough? Well, I would say to you, in building on Bernard's point, if that's all we want young people to do, then I guess it's good enough. But if we want young people to graduate with a thirst for knowledge, with having a sense of history, of culture, of geography, of international affairs, a sense of the arts, of music. I believe those things are part of education, are they not? We're not testing for that. What would it take to get there? First of all, it would take a very different attitude that we have to education. It would mean that the curiosity that we see in 3- and 4-year-olds would be there when our young people are 17 and 18. That desire to learn. It would take a school day that doesn't start at 9 o'clock and finishes at 3. It would take a schooling system that is totally tied into the community environment. Social services, the business sector, obviously government, but that the walls that separate schooling would disappear, and we would begin to see learning as interdisciplinary, not disciplinary. Parents are a child's first teacher. And yet, as soon as children start school, we say goodbye to parents, we take over children, and that is the end of the relationship. It's tenuous in the early years. By the time they get to middle school or junior high school, secondary school, they wouldn't let you drop them off in front of the front door of the school. If we want trust in education, we have to have trust in the people who run the educational system. It's those relationships. It's the relationships with the teachers, with the administrators, with the police, with the social services that is going to change the environment, I think. So the engagement strategy is animating the community to have a common vision. It is helping kids make the transition from home to school, from middle school to secondary school, and from secondary school to college, university, and work. That means employers have to be in the high schools. It means that high school teachers have to be in the college and university environment. It means that we have to work with the unions and they do have a responsibility vis-a-vis trades and apprenticeship programs. It means that private sector, corporate leaders should be in our schools, understanding what principals face, and principals should be in the business sector, understanding what business people face as well. I'll finish with this. When I reimagine schooling, I reimagine an environment where people come together in a school, not as a place owned by educators, but as a place owned by the community. I imagine a place and an experience that is not personally challenging and intellectually permissive, but intellectually challenging and personally permissive. And I imagine a place that welcomes the family and ushers the family to the next transition. Bernard, you quoted a number of books. I just finished reading The Outliers. I don't know how many of you have read that. And what it talks about, this is Malcolm Gladwell. If you haven't, I encourage you to read it. Because what he talks about, he's the guy who wrote The Tipping Point. He looks at leaders, Wayne Gretzky, Bill Gates, and what he looks at is the circumstances under which these people have become such tremendous forces. And if you think about it, what he talks about is 10,000 hours of work. So if there are any kindergarten teachers in this room, I'd like you to think about the fact that no matter whether they're boys or girls, whether they are born in January or in November, all these children are different. In kindergarten, you really, really see it. But if each one had 10,000 hours of work from a community, they could be, perhaps, Wayne Gretzky's. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Bernard and Veronica. The task at hand to address what I find a challenging and perplexing question, I think got decidedly more difficult being on the tail end of both your presentations. And to some degree, I think what I had thought about saying this evening has probably changed somewhat. Particularly, I found, Bernard, your framing to be very helpful in trying to grapple with the question of trust in education, but also to get a sense of kind of where we are as a society around questions surrounding education, the efficacy thereof, and also what the kind of connecting points are between what we call education, which in large measure, again, as per Bernard's presentation, being the same as schooling, and I think it's an important distinction that he made that indeed it is not. But look, I come at this with a number of biases, if you will, as someone who's spent my life in and around education, and someone who fervently believes, I mean, just one of the deepest beliefs I hold is that sense, a deep and abiding belief in the transformative power of education. I still sit in wonder at what goes on between and among human beings when learning is involved. There is something special about the way we connect as human beings through the learning process. Thus the passion that it engenders, not only when one is a participant, but also when one enters debates such as this. Let me try to underscore that because I think it's easy to be. We were talking a bit about trust and level of cynicism, and that's a pretty strong statement that I just made. But it's one that I think that'll stand up to a fairly straightforward test. I'm just going to pick a year at random. I'd like everybody to think for a moment, see if you can conjure up either the mental image of the face or the name of your grade 9 teacher. How many people can do that? Pretty much the majority. Now quickly think of 3 other important things that happened in your life that year. It's not nearly as easy to do. There's a reason that you can remember the name of your grade 9 teacher. And I could have picked grade 7, grade 6, grade 3, or grade 12, and you would have done the same thing. There's something that goes on when we're engaged with another human being or human beings when learning is involved. And it is important for us to remember that for a variety of reasons. The first, if I can be playful with this, if anyone has the luxury of smiling from the grave, I believe it's Max Weber, right? The sociologist who spent much time studying bureaucracies and the way we organize things. And one of his conclusions was that when we, as human beings, discover something that is good and we want to do more of it, we organize it, right? We try to scale it up. And to some degree, we create a form of bureaucracy in order to do that. And there seems to be some inviolable rule in the cosmos that has us wring out the very thing that we wanted to do more of when we set the bureaucracy in place to actually have it occur more successfully. And frankly, and as one who is involved in an institutional setting, I think it's something we've got to come to grips with because I don't think the education system is immune from that. Veronica made reference to this. I mean, and we simply can't ignore what we've all observed. 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, they are learning machines. We are hardwired to learn. And we do it exceedingly well, given the developmental aspects that limit that as brain wiring comes into place and otherwise. But that is what we are wired to do. And I think all of us would agree that the way in which we institutionalize education can have either positive or negative effects on that. I think the prevailing view, although I don't think we have good data to describe it, is that somehow participating in the institutional structures of learning is inhibiting in terms of that creativity. And one does not need to look at the public education system to come to that conclusion. I'll go to the post-secondary realm that I am part of. I remember a wonderfully elegant little study in the U.S. back in the 80s that took a simple test of creativity for incoming students to first year of either an arts program or a science program. Did the same test of creativity 4 years later when those students graduated. And as somebody who has a background in and affection for science, I was dismayed by the outcome. You can see where this is going. In the arts students, their tests of creativity improved over the 4 years. In science students, they declined. We did something to them, right? It's hard to believe that it's some other force that acted on them. So the way we organize this is not unimportant. And the question of what schools and what education means to us as a society, and again, this is what caused me to move into a different realm in my comments, because I think Bernard is so right in reflecting upon the world in which we live and the implications of our educational systems at this point in time. And and let me try to get at that in a couple of ways. One is, and I recognize some learned educators in the room. I think one of the things they would remind us all of is that in the history of Western civilization generally, the period of time within which we have undergone compulsory public education is relatively recent. And has been marked, arguably, by relatively smooth patterns of development, even the Industrial Revolution. Right? But the world we live in today, the rapidity of change, the complexity of that world, the level of ambiguity that exists within it, and the absolute explosion of knowledge, right? I mean, we're trying to grapple with this in the post-secondary realm, where the estimates vary, and I question how robust some of them are, but we've got to come to grips with, if we're on a content basis, somewhere between 30 and 70% of content, especially on application, is likely rendered obsolescent within the simple 4-year time frame of an undergraduate degree. I mean, we've never been on this ground before. And how we deal with that as a society, I believe, is absolutely important. Otherwise, I think we run the risk of, that old adage, when all you've got is a hammer, everything will look like a nail. Right? If we only have a system, a way of doing this, and especially one, the key word I think is discontinuity here, is that, reflect for a moment on the economic collapse that we've just witnessed. I think one of the important lessons, for me at least, was that you talk about trust. Does it not shake our confidence in the cognoscenti? Does it not shake our confidence in predictive models that were supposed to be able to see this coming? Or the superordinate structures that we had created, national and beyond, that were supposed to prevent this from happening? It happened nonetheless. And likely because the past and the orthodoxies of the past were not sufficiently robust to move forward into the future. Which, by the way, is something that we expect we're able to create within the individual, within our education system. But it didn't happen. If you look at the intractability of the environmental problems we face today, I think you'll see a similar kind of pattern. We are groping around. We are floundering in terms of trying to light on using existing structures in order to solve current and future problems. So what does that have to do specifically with the education question? Well, here's something that I would leave with you. I do not pretend to have the answer here. But I do believe that one of the challenges in the theme of this series that we attempted to explore was around trust in education. I think Bernard tonight put his finger on one part of this challenge, which is, to some degree, our expectation, unfairly I believe, that we pass to educators and the school system, quote unquote, all of the challenges of this incredibly complex world that we are showing little capacity to deal with outside the educational realm, and then expect the education system to deal with all of that. I think, to me, that I can't make that mental leap. I think that's one of the issues. The second issue is that I believe as well we have not turned the question into a fundamental public debate. Let's roll the clock back. Relatively recent time, yes. But if we look at the history of the implementation of mandatory public education, it was really born out of a sense of what kind of society do we want to live in. It was born out of democratic principles, It was born out of a sense of how one was to fully participate. There were certainly, the educators were interested in questions of pursuit of one's most authentic self, but it was a societal debate. Those in the audience that know more about the educational history than I will know that it was a fundamental debate. And even in my early years, I can remember how public and how powerful the debate was in the United States when Kennedy's education secretary made a fairly hard run at extending the public education realm to 14 years rather than 12. So 2 years into what we described to be in the post-secondary realm. Didn't actually happen, but the debate was framed on a decision by a society as to what it was we were trying to do with our institutionalized learning system. I fear that there is almost an absence of that debate, while there are profound changes occurring simply because of the exigencies of the day, that there is almost an absence of that debate within the public realm. So whose education system is it anyway? It's ours. It's a collective. But, I mean, again, I'll look in the post-secondary realm. We have had a fundamental change in Canada over the past 20 years in the proportion of the cost of education borne by the state versus the individual. That change has occurred, in my view, arguably, but in my view, with very little substantive public debate. It occurred because of policy actions. It occurred because of political decisions. But did those live up, if you will, to that same standard by which we introduced our public education system broadly in the first place? I don't believe so. Not even close. And I don't think we'll find the answer unless that occurs. In the same way, and again, this is a bit hyperbolic and a bit more provocative perhaps than I should. But one of the things that's crossed my mind in the last 5 years or so in Canada is that I wish we could have taken some of the energy that we've used for the debate around national health care and put it into education. Just the debate. Just the belief of our public that we have something to say about the role of education and how it meets what we are attempting to do as a society. We seem to be willing, increasingly, to have that debate in health. I still think it's wanting on the education side. So then it becomes, to some degree, it becomes those on the outside and the educators on the inside in what often becomes a pointed discussion and debate about what is wanting in either realm. My experience has been very seldom does that dialectic produce creative results. Certainly not shared. So I'm going to end simply on a framing of this in some ways. Many, again, in the room will know that the Latin root of the word education actually means to lead out. And I think it's appropriate for us to contemplate that in trying to assess this question. It seems to me that our educational institutions have always been one of the societal constructs that we've looked to rather than simply being a mirror of the society that they're part of and serve, to be a beacon for something better, which is entirely consistent with the etymology of the word, and I think exactly what we need at this time. I would say that the question of how we do this and the question of the role of education in not just the society of the day, but in what we want to be, is one that belongs to all of us. And while I'm not totally given over in terms of the imperative around this, because I think those of us that were very keen on this series coming to reality, one of the reasons we were keen was feeling the pressure and the need to at least start asking some of these questions, because I think that I do believe we are in a period where we're going to continue to see extreme discontinuities, and we are going to see potential harm to many segments of our society if we don't come to grips with this. So as we do, again, while not completely given over to Hegelian philosophy, there is one observation that Hegel put forth that I just absolutely carry around with me, and that is, hell is truth seen too late. So let us find the truth around this question. Thank you.
Well, I hardly know what to say, to be truthful, but let me try. I mean, it makes no sense, and it's not my job to summarize what's been said, but I do want to pick up a few points and try to help open it up so we can all have a good discussion, because I very much agree with the concept that we need a debate, and I would never want to think that this series is the end of this. I'd like to think rather this is just one thing that has to be talked about and discussed and improved upon forever and ever. What I heard tonight actually gave me much more hope than I had when I came in here. So that's useful, to me at least, because I heard everybody saying that a system that's open, that's positive, is a good thing. A system that's transparent is a good thing. I heard people, I think, largely saying they feel trusting, at least, in the education system. I didn't hear anybody up here tonight say they don't trust the education system or that it's hopeless or anything like that, but rather that we get an awful lot for what we pay for, and perhaps more than we should expect. And with it, several things. The responsibility for many more groups in society and people to be involved in education. We have to be responsible for our own education, our own learning. Our employers have to do much more. And I know that a number of people up here, including myself and Ray, have worked on this kind of thing and found, by and large, employers really aren't ready to hear that yet. They don't believe that they won't have the kind of employees that they need in the future. And by and large, they're not willing to invest in that, with a few exceptions around this area, and those exceptions are doing extremely well with the programs they've put together to work with the schools or the community colleges or whatever other groups that they have aligned themselves with. The concept that how we organize to educate and to learn is crucial. It's true. The concept of choice. I was delighted to hear several people talk about the fact that we need choices, parents need choices, students need choices. And I was taken a little bit with something. I was thinking about this last week when I was on the plane. And I was coming back from Toronto, and this happened to be the National Post, but the next day I saw similar articles in the Globe and Mail. And I know there's many sides to this story, but let me just throw it out because I thought it was interesting in this day of openness and trust that there would be a headline that says, Ontario's education minister will kill a government website feature that allows parents to compare school performance, bowing to activist groups who said it promoted a shopping mentality in the publicly funded system. Now, I don't know what other people's take on that, but mine was, God forbid that parents should want to shop around. Now, I know the article goes on and says, but there's information not everybody could have. But the truth is, some bureaucrats have decided that they can keep the information, but others shouldn't have it. I don't think that is open or transparent, so I think that's a negative thing that does indeed happen in our system. And there are other like that. We talked a little bit about employers expecting too much and how great our literacy and numeracy is, and yet in this province we have, and one of our major employers saying that on a regular basis, I think I have to find this quote here, essentially they find something like 65 to 75% of the students that they test who are high school grads fail their literacy and numeracy test, which is geared to the grade 8 level. Now that's a discouraging thing, and I know people don't want to hear it, but I say in this province, that's hundreds of tests every year. It isn't just an odd thing, it's hundreds of tests that are given every year by this particular employer. So something is missing for some students. Having said that, let me make one more comment, and then let's open this up for all of us to talk about. And in that sense, I'd like to quote Gabriela Mistral, a Chilean poet and a Nobel laureate, who said, "Many things can wait, the child cannot. Now is the time his bones are being formed, his mind is being developed. To him we cannot say tomorrow. His name is today." So let's, with that thought in mind and all we've heard tonight from these great speakers, open it up to participation. And who's first up?
Hi, my name's Diana. I am a concerned citizen. I am a member of an organization called SASAC, which stands for Skeptics and Secularists Atlantic Canada, and that's not to be confused with the word cynic. For comments on the education system to teach the ability of students to differentiate between belief and knowledge. An example between valid science and pseudoscience, legitimate medicine and pseudomedicine, faith and fact, tolerance and skepticism, superstition and empirical reality.
Thank you. Who would like to have a crack at that?
I'll try it. I think that without pretending that I know a lot about it in terms of just how much superstition is encouraged in various schools, I haven't noticed it myself, but that I'm not all that experienced. But I think that there is a wonderful tool out there to help us with this problem of how it is you come to decide that something is real in some sense, or something is true in some other sense. And that is, interestingly enough, the availability of access to the internet. There is so much stuff out there that is nonsense, so to speak, as well as so much stuff out there that is interesting, that it presents a wonderful exercise for students in either elementary school or high school to take whatever knowledge they bring to the context, because students don't go to the libraries anymore, they go to the internet, for the teachers to use that as a way of saying how it is, tell me now how it is you've come to believe that. And we have to remember that not everyone believes that science is the only way to know. And so we have to be careful. But that's no reason that someone can't explain to themselves or to anyone else how it is they have come to know. So that given that kind of facility, it seems to me if that is the problem, I haven't noticed it obviously to the extent that you have, but that may just be my problem, then there is a way to deal with that both in schooling and elsewhere. So that, but you can't be afraid of political correctness at the same time. You've either got to decide you're going to be one way or the other.
Anybody else want to have a
I just make a quick comment in agreement. It seems to me that rather than put the filter, if you will, on the front end, I'd rather see the aim of education to provide students with the capacity to do the filtering themselves, to be able to understand a range of ways of knowing and understand the merits and to be able to compare and contrast and come to some conclusion with a broad base of possibilities rather than have it narrowed for them. I mean, I can think of some of the more interesting curriculum work that I've been involved in surrounded a BSc program that combined, if you will, the more traditional science methodologies and scientific methods with Aboriginal ways of knowing in terms of nature and biology, etc. And the interesting thing in that, after it was put into effect, was of course what students did with it, because it gave them a much broader way of looking at the world and evaluating the world around them. So I think, I think in terms of the question, there's no doubt we need one of the tests, I believe, of education for simply good citizenry, to quote Dewey, is that we have students that are capable of understanding a number of ways of knowing and being able to deal with those. Because quite simply, if we narrow their options in what they look at in the public school system, the world will blow that open anyway. So why don't we embrace that within the structure of the school system and then give them the capacity to deal with it?
Okay, thank you. Next question.
My name is Mark Mercer, and I teach philosophy here at St. Mary's. I agree entirely with Dr. Shapiro that in a liberal democracy, what we should be looking for from education is the production of, creating students who are morally and intellectually autonomous agents. But I worry about how to go about helping students become morally autonomous agents. I'm concerned about the chance, the risk of indoctrination, of the sorts of pressures towards conformity that ethics, education of that sort often involves. I wonder if it's not just enough to take care of the intellectual and let the moral development take care of itself. As long as teachers are good role models, as long as the school is fair, then the sorts of interactions that we want, respectful interactions among students, ought to develop. Is that right? Or, I mean, what would look like ways of inculcating in children qualities like empathy, compassion, respect for others, that isn't a form of indoctrinating them through pressure into those ways?
Thank you. Veronica, do you want to have a crack at that first?
Well, to take us back, God, so many years into values education, so you will know what I'm talking about. I don't think that that you can teach in a value-neutral way. As soon as a teacher appears in front of young people, they're teaching as much by how they appear in the world as by what they say. And I would say that the more personal education is, the more we address the issue that the previous speaker asked about, the more the classroom experience becomes a dynamic conversation and interaction between human beings, the more you're getting at the issue that you're talking about. We have the most wonderful laboratory in our schools in Canada today and tomorrow, because the issue of diversity is right there. By engaging students in a conversation and asking them how they view the world and how they view each other, you begin to deal with the issue of moral purpose of learning and the integrity of individuals, as well as the respect that you establish in the environment. But I would say that no public policy, no guidelines from school boards or principals that simply talk about respect but ignore the differences in the way teachers teach students or students treat each other, or even how parents are welcomed into the school, will teach the kind of situation that you're talking about. Nobody teaches empathy in a more profound and powerful way than an empathetic teacher.
Well, I guess I would agree that it's a minefield. Yeah. That is, I think that it is very, very easy to fall into not sort of moral development, but a kind of unthinking moral certitude just because of the way in which this matter is developed. So I think that is a problem. I'd say that right away. On the other hand, I'm convinced that in a society as heterogeneous as this one, it will not just happen by happenstance. The fact is, it hasn't happened. And so I think that there is a way to proceed on two different grounds. One is not to try to develop in classrooms right answers to certain kinds of questions. It's certainly not another course of moral philosophy, for example, or something like that. But to always look for opportunities when they arise to raise the question in classrooms or any other kind of educational environment about whether there is, for example, an ethical dimension to this matter that we're currently discussing. Is this something worth thinking about? And what do you think about it? And how can I help you think that through? So I think that there is a way to proceed that would heighten people's awareness of the fact that judgments of right and wrong, they're going to be constantly making anyway. And so to learn to try to think about those in an environment with other thinkers who will not be the same, I think has some opportunities in it. There clearly is a minefield. There's plenty of indoctrination going on in some of our schools, by the way. This is not something new to the educational system.
Well, can I just, about that, I mean, you're right. I agree. What you're suggesting is fine. But the reality seems to be, and again, I'm just talking about my own grade 3 son in grade 1, is that at their school, the way of dealing with conflict and differences in morals seems to be, well, everybody's right, we're not going to talk about it. Everybody's right in their own terms. If you make a critical comment about some way that something's going or some practice, that's to be offensive, that's to hurt feelings, and that's not to be done. I think this is part of a sort of an ideology that undercuts our liberal ideals. This is the ideology that beliefs and ways of life are to be respected, and that we respect people by respecting their feelings, in that we're not going to do things that could potentially hurt their feelings. Anyway, I think that's the reality that we have to, when we talk about inculcating certain ways of dealing with others or approaching others or a moral attitude toward the world. We have to keep in mind that that the idea that it is beliefs that need to be respected, that's ways of life that need to be respected, is a prevalent idea among educators.
I agree with that. Just specifies the nature of the challenge.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next question.
Yeah, hi, my name is Matthias. I'm actually an immigrant, and I live in Nova Scotia since 6 years. How can we, seeing this point, how can we build institutions or make institutions more transparent and more able, more talented to reform themselves? Because even democratic institutions tend to be not democratic.
Good, thank you. Bernard, do you want to have a crack at that?
Well, I can only repeat what is obvious, which is it is true that institutionalization can be deadening as well as enlivening, and that we're not very good at stopping what one starts, even if it's not producing the results that we would prefer. And so there is a constant need in society at large and in education as well for alternative models to be developing all the time, so that alternatives to whatever the current institutional preference is become available to the public. So that's why, for example, school choice is an important thing in my view, so that one doesn't have the system to go to, have a variety of different options, often within the same system, for example, that can be helpful. But there is no magic bullet to the Garden of Eden. There's no magic entry. The only thing you can do is assess what the current situation is and ask yourself where there's an opening. The only time you fail is when you find an opening and refuse to go into it. It's always risky, it's always dangerous, because a lot's at stake, but the future will be to those that take those risks.
Next question. Thank you, Bernard.
My name is Tamara Lawrence. I'm the Executive Director of the Nova Scotia Environmental Network, and I help coordinate a working group called SENSE, Sustainability Education in Nova Scotia for Everyone. My question is, this is not just actually an education question, it also relates to health. It's affecting kids, in terms of asthma and cancer rates, and it's also a survival issue. So I would like to hear the panelists' thoughts about how we get more serious about environment, not just in our school systems, but also in society. How do we seriously advance sustainability education? And I'd like to share a resource with you and with the audience. The GPI Atlantic just released a report last year called How Educated Are Nova Scotians? And this is one of the issues that they looked at. So I'll share that with the panelists.
Thank you very much. Veronica, do you want to start?
Let me start by clarifying something, and I hope that you didn't hear me say that we have the most educated country in the world. What I was trying to say is that in terms of international standards, our 13 to 16-year-olds perform extremely well in math and science, in reading and writing. My point is, that's not an educated person. An educated person is much more than that. To go back to the last speaker, so long as educators own the educational system, it will not change. So long as those walls are not porous, are not penetrable, it will not change. There is no innate desire of an institution to change itself. But there is a desire on the part of educators to do the best they can for children. So if we can build on that and explode our concept of schooling through alternative models, through the engagement of others who are also teachers, I think that we can begin to move down on that line. There is no one size that fits all. There never was. Well, imagine with the diversity that we're going to have in our schools over the next 20 years. For sure, there's not one size that fits all.
I would say that I agree with the speaker in a certain sense. That is, it is true that at least in most schools that I'm aware of, the question of ecology or sustainability doesn't come up nearly as often as one might expect, although there's been a lot more program development in this area than there was, let's say, 10 or 20 years ago. There are all kinds of new institutes, new this, new that, new curriculum programs in this area. They may not be sufficient, but they're certainly a lot better than they were. Whether we're all too late to make any difference is another question. If that's the case, then I guess we can stop worrying about it. But if it's not the case, then it's a question of heightened awareness. It's a question of more grassroots pressure from a variety of different sources so that the system does in the end respond. Squeaky wheels do get paid attention to, it turns out. And so that all one can do is not, other than complain, is to ask yourself, how can I be an activist in this area, and where is the leverage where I can make a difference? And I think that is what's available to us, and that's what has to be sufficient unto the day, because no one else is going to do it. Because the facts are, if you look at the politics of this, then we're faced with a choice of short-term jobs and long-term sustainability. Everybody seems to vote for the short-term jobs. That, I don't say that's a good thing. I just say that's a fact of the environment we're living in, and we have to be able to make sense out of that context if we expect to move forward. I think another thing Veronica mentioned, I think it's worth saying, Veronica mentioned that as long as educators own the system, there's an issue, and I agree with her entirely. That's another thing about that this organization might think of in terms of future programs. Is if you want to take a look at trust in education, you need to ask people in addition to educators.
Just a quick comment. I mean, I would absolutely agree. I think you've raised one of the most profound questions that my generation, your generation, are attempting to grapple with. I indicated in my comments, I think we've been groping around on this question for some time, and the only sort of balancing comment that I would make is that, as Alan mentioned, I've recently joined Acadia University, and I've been tremendously impressed immediately at the degree to which the institution and its students have grabbed hold of the sustainability question, and quite frankly, and appropriately, I think, the students are pushing the university to do more on many fronts, and if they are, and I think we've got at least anecdotal evidence that the generation that are in universities and colleges today have a heightened environmental awareness. Ask most parents about who keeps them on track in terms of recycling in their households. If that's the case, I suspect that some of the reason why that awareness is there is what they've internalized by virtue of their experience in the school system. So it's not a panacea by any stretch of the imagination, but quite frankly, I have more faith in the generation that comes behind us than I do in our own. I mean, our time in many ways is close to being through in making a contribution. Those in my generation, you can argue the degree to which we failed, but I don't think you can argue that we have failed in coming to grips with the issues around sustainability. So I have greater optimism that the next generation will deal with this in a much, much different and more effective way. Doesn't help us in the short term, but may in the longer term.
Last question.
Always. My name is Marcia, and I'm going to begin with the question. The question is, do you share my concern, and what are we going to do about it? And in order to explain that question, I will tell you about a personal experience that I had 2 weeks ago. This was a class in third year, St. Mary's, a wonderful set of 50 very smart, very animated, very lively students. And I was trying to explain to them what the literature says the difference is between hostility and anger. This is a class in health psychology. And in order to do that, I read off a series of 1-point items from a test of hostility to explain to the students these are the questions that you would be asked on one of those. And we came to a question that said, do you agree or not? Most people would lie in order to get ahead. Now, I'm sure you understand that third-year students are reluctant to raise their hands at any time. But I saw 75 to 80% of these kids agree with that. And then I made a mistake. I stopped. And they started to tell me what they believed in this moral issue. You're looking puzzled. Do you have a question? No. The point I'm trying to make is that if we're going to deal with morality in this culture, in this society, in universities, we have to know what we're starting with. And I was shocked. Do you share my concern? And what are we going to do about it?
I was expecting just a little more information. I'm not sure what it is the students thought. I got the question, but you never did say what you were shocked by.
Oh. I was shocked by the cynicism that those responses represented.
The responses being that they would lie to get ahead.
Most people would lie. And then I made another mistake, and that was, would you lie to get ahead? And they weren't willing to raise their hands, but they were willing to nod their heads. So the point I'm trying to make is, when we're trying to teach people things, we usually look at the prerequisites. What do they know already? And I was shocked at the product that comes into third-year university and their view of what is right and what is acceptably wrong. And if I had it to do over again, I would have gone further and said, do you know that that's wrong? And I hesitated. That wasn't where I wanted to take this class, into a confrontation about right and wrong. But I think the issue I'm raising is relevant to what you were speaking about, and I'd like to hear your comments.
Well, I certainly agree that it's relevant. It doesn't, however, surprise me at all. That is because, let me use a kind of example from another environment altogether, not an educational environment. Let's talk about the International Olympic Games. As long as the gold medal is the only thing that matters, we shouldn't be surprised if people take drugs. The difference of 1/100th of a second is what makes a difference between one kind of life and another kind of life altogether. When the cult of celebrity has gone that far, it would be amazing if students, in fact, didn't answer positively to the question, what do you think other people would lie in order to get ahead? Because what they're learning almost every day in the papers, on television, etc., is that people do. And so I think what I would, faced with that, I would have tried, I think, it's always easy to say when it happened to someone else instead of you, but what I would have tried to do was put aside whatever it was you were planning to do, whatever direction you were trying to take the students in, and say, this is an opportunity for us to do something a little different today and raise these issues in a way that perhaps would be helpful in the future. I think that's what people have to do more often than they do. I know it's difficult. I know it's a minefield. But if one wants to make progress in this area, you can't do it by simply ignoring it.
I've had the good fortune to teach at all levels, university, elementary, secondary. And in 40 years of education, probably the best course I ever taught was a course on values education. And this was in the 70s. My principal had to defend me against the Ministry of Education, who felt that I had no right teaching values education in a publicly funded school. Sorry, Chris. Actually, my principal, who I'm forever grateful to him, because the question came from the minister's office, what is she doing teaching values education? And yet, the response that I got from the students taught me a very important lesson, and that is that unless you're talking about values, which is often politically incorrect, and it's very messy you're not really reaching the heart of the matter. And the teachable moment, which is what you're talking about, is so much more important than the content. It took me a long time to understand that the passive paraphrastic and that the subjunctive were not the most important things for kids to learn. The ablative absolute, yes. But when you engage young people in that discussion, there is a right and wrong. And we better talk about that.
It is indeed an honor and a privilege for me to be invited to thank our guest speakers and our panelists tonight. This evening's dialogue, I believe, is fundamental to who we are as a society. Bernard's opening comments that trust is a rare commodity is very telling and very searing to us as a society as a whole, and to those of us who are committed as committed educators. So in reflecting back on what I heard tonight, I think what I heard is that we need engaged learners, we need engaged parents, employers, community members at large. We need engaged educators as learners themselves. We need education to be understood more broadly than schooling, and we truly need to understand as educators that students will learn more outside the school system now than they ever do within the narrow confines of schooling. Some of the challenges that we are facing, we're facing different models of education, and Bernard described the teacher-centered model versus the progressive student approach, and that difference in model may lead to distrust in itself. We've learned that our approaches to data are not convincing and developing trust within the public. Getting tied up on Campbell's Law, we may need to widen the numbers of indicators of good education that we continue to explore and develop. And while nothing can assure success in the educational enterprise, and I use that in the broadest sense that Bernard used it, failure can be guaranteed if we stay committed to the status quo. So in terms of how we will know, I've learned from all of the speakers tonight is that our ability to engage in the dialogue with our whole community makes the difference in terms of where we want to go. Veronica stated that we need to trust people as educators in the education system. While as an educator, I would also say that we as educators need to learn to trust our parents, our students as learners, our employers, and our broader community. We can't back away from developing that trust that leads out into our community. So I want to thank the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs and St. Mary's University and the Atlantic School of Theology for creating this forum for public dialogue. From my personal perspective, I know I will be going back to our school system, and for those of you who don't know me, it's the Halifax Regional School Board, and I will continue this dialogue within our community of educators, with our board members, with our students, and our broader community. Bernard, I will make a personal commitment to you to see if I can find the courage to flaunt an interesting failure within the HRSB. So on behalf of everyone who is here tonight, I want to express our deepest gratitude to Bernard Shapiro, to Veronica Lacey, and to Brie Ivany for challenging our assumptions and our thinking about this very deep moral and intellectual issue that will affect who we are as individuals and as a society. And as educators, we will work each and every day to make a difference for each student that we are serving. To fulfill this goal, we need to continue this dialogue within our community in a deep and ongoing way. So thank you to each of us for helping us move on that journey. Thank you.